All right, so this Knife Thoughts video is going to be on this knife. This is a Hinderer Knives XM18 3.5 with the Bowie blade shape. And first of all, what are Hinderer Knives? So Hinderer Knives is a company started by and run by Rick Hinderer. And Rick Hinderer was a farrier, which is someone who puts shoes on horses, horseshoes, and that's where it's suggested he got his interest in knife making. And he started as a custom knife maker, so he would make, custom fixed blades and I believe some custom folders also. And from there, he moved into making mid-tech knives. So the definition of a mid-tech knife kind of nebulous, up in the air, kind of vague, but it's a knife that's somewhere between a custom knife and a production knife. Now, whether or not a Hinderer knife is in that definition, fits within that definition, I'm not really here to say, but that's kind of what's suggested in when you look up information about Hinderer knives that these are. And there is, good reason to say that these Hinderer knives are not the same as a, general normal production knife from Benchmade, Spyderco, things like that, or maybe ZT, which you'll see more of this later, because they're all made at what they call the ranch in Shreve, Ohio, which is the Hinderer Knives manufacturing base. So according to what I've found online, what I've read online, pretty much all of the knife is made there. So, everything's CNC, everything's cut out there or pressed there, and they do pretty much everything at the ranch. So that's definitely a little different than your typical production knife, and gives it a little bit different of a feel to it. They also say that they go through more of a quality control process than your typical production knife. So that's what Rick Hinderer knives are, and they became popular because Rick Hinderer has experience as a first responder, and a lot of their knives are influenced from that experience or influenced by that experience. So, for example, if you look at this knife, the pivot is made so that you can adjust it with basically just a flathead screwdriver. It's a what I know as being called a male and female pivot, and you just can adjust it by turning this with anything really that would work like a flathead screwdriver. So easier to adjust in the field. They also have the flipper, which when they introduced this model was the XM model, and the flippers was not as popular as it is now. Now there's, every knife company makes flipper knives. Spyderco kind of held out for a while, but pretty much every big or small, well-known or not well-known knife company is making flipper knives, but it was something that wasn't seen as much, and the idea behind it is that when you're wearing gloves, which often you would be if you were a first responder or something, in the military or something like that, it's easier to open a knife by the flipper because you just have to, put your finger on the flipper and, flip it open, versus something like the knife that I'm carrying today, a Rat 1, where with a glove on, it might be a little tougher to get in this little space there and open the knife. So that's another way that they're, made to be able to be used in the field by first responders or people in the military and things like that. So that's kind of how they became popular, but they also have done some innovation, and kind of all of this video might remind you of my video on the Chris Reeve in Cosi, but they've done some innovations. So one of the earlier things that they did, and again, I'm not 100% sure that they introduced all these innovations, but they popularized them. One thing that they did was the lock bar stabilizer. So what that does is it's basically a thing that's screwed in there, and it stops the lock bar from being able to be pushed too far. So again, if you have gloves on and you're not paying attention, you're doing something in an emergency situation where you really need to open and close the knife quickly, you don't want to press a lock bar too hard, too far, because what that will do is if you do press it too far, it will basically bend this so that it doesn't bend the whole way back. So that this lock bar will lose the spring that it should have, or some of that spring. So that lock bar stabilizer stops that from happening. When you press this right there, it won't go any further or any farther, and so you don't have to worry about damaging the lock. And at the same time, like I've mentioned in other videos on the frame lock, the big upside to the frame lock that makes it, I disagree with it being stronger, but maybe more dependable in those type situations, emergencies, or tactical situations, things like that, is that when you're holding the knife like this, your finger is actually holding this lock bar in place, so that as long as you're holding it like that, it's not going to come unlocked. So that's another thing that makes it, a fitting design for that type of usage profile. Another thing that they introduced, and this specific knife doesn't have this feature, but something that and for this one they didn't invent it, but they kind of brought it to the market and popularized it on folding knives, is what they call the Sponto tip. So it's basically a combination of a spear tip and a tanto, or tanto, however you say it, tip, so that it creates a strong tip, but more of a usable tip in the shape of a spear point blade. So again, not this blade shape, but something that they introduced that gives you the strength of a tanto with more of the general use friendly blade shape of the spear point. Another thing that they were doing before it was popular, before it was widespread, is the lock bar insert. Now, this knife doesn't actually have it. This isn't the newest model of Hinderer knives or of the XM18. And another thing that they've introduced pretty recently, or relatively recently, that this knife doesn't have is the tri-way pivot. So the tri-way pivot is kind of an interesting idea. It was introduced on the half-track model, I believe, either the half-track or the full-track. I'm pretty sure the half-track. And what it is it's basically you have three different options for the pivot. One is definitely a ball bearing pivot. One is definitely a bronze washer pivot. I think one might be a Teflon pivot too. I'm not 100% sure. Again, this doesn't have it. And then on the half track, at least, it also actually has a tool built into the handle that allows you to take the knife apart and maintain the knife. So that is another innovation that Rick Hinderer Knives has brought to the market that fits along into that kind of user profile of being well made for people in first responder or emergency or tactical situations. Now, one other thing that has kind of become known about Hinderer Knives is that for a while there were a lot of reports, or if not a lot, a significant number of reports that the the detent was weak enough that it was difficult to flip the knives. So the detent, the ball that is on the lock bar, you can see where it runs along the blade, and then the ball sits into a hole in the blade. That holds it closed, and also is an important aspect of a flipper knife, because that kind of breakaway that detent provides is what allows you to flip it. If it didn't have that, I'm going to not let it sit into the detent, then it would be really difficult to flip it open. So with a weak detent, as some of these were reported to have, it was difficult to flip it open. I've seen on blade forums people talking about the knives opening in their pockets. I've had that happen on assisted knives, but never on a flipper. You never know what can happen, but it's certainly not an issue on this specific knife. As you can see, it flips really well. It flips both as a light switch style and a little bit better probably as a push button style flip. What that means, if you haven't heard that before, light switch style is when you do it like you're turning a light switch off or on, like that. And a push button is like you're pushing a button, so it's just straight in, like that. So no issues on this one, but it is something that people have reported. One thing that's interesting about that is I haven't used Hinderer's warranty or their refurb service, but when I was looking at the warranty, they still do not basically cover if someone considers their knife to have a weak detent under the warranty. It actually says that if you have trouble flipping your knife, there's a kind of an aside on the warranty page that said, for those of you who can't flip your knife open to your liking, this is not a warranty or service issue. There are plenty of threads on the subject in our online forums at bladeforums.com and usualsuspects.net, as well as YouTube videos that can help you. Oil, pivot adjustments, and technique is where you will find your answers. The same goes for blade centering. Lots of threads and info on the forums to help you out. So neither blade centering, which same deal here on this specific model, pretty much perfect blade centering. So this knife has neither of those issues, but kind of interesting that they specifically say that those are not covered in the warranty. And also to me, somewhat interesting that they point you to the threads at Blade Forums, because they're, when you look it up, I looked up Hinderer warranty, and the first thread on Blade Forums wasn't really a primarily positive thread about the warranty. It was an older thread though. And one thing that I will mention is it looks like Hinderer Knives has updated their warranty policy somewhat to make it a little bit more lenient, specifically on modification. So you can see on this knife, it has had some aftermarket anodization, and this is electrical anodization, not heat anodization. Hope I'm saying that right. I think you know what I mean. The coloring of the titanium. And they've specifically said that electric anodization is not something that voids the warranty, whereas heat discoloration basically is something that voids the warranty. They've also said that, interestingly, regrinds, if done correctly, do not void the warranty, and several other things like that. So they have somewhat updated and made the warranty a little bit more inclusive. And again, similar to Chris Reeve knives, which I really think that Hinderer knives, they intend to be in that same space as Chris Reeve knives. They also provide or offer a refurbishment service. Now, the Hinderer Knives refurbishment service, according to their website, is $65, and how much they can do depends on the knife and its finish and stuff like that, but it is something that they offer. So again, kind of similar in the same market space as Chris Reeve knives. So that's a lot of information on Rick Hinderer knives in general. About this specific knife, I traded into this knife. I would like to show you it compared to the Chris Reeve and Cosi, or any Chris Reeve, but I actually traded the Chris Reeve and Cosi I recently did a video on for this knife. So I don't have it to show as a comparison. I do have the zero tolerance that I showed earlier as a comparison that I'll talk about in a little bit. But this knife on its own, kind of not comparing it, but just my thoughts on it, I really like the ergonomics of it. Similar, actually, again, to the Incosi. Sometimes I don't like finger choils, kind of scallops like this, but again, this handle is really comfortable. I would say that this handle is more comfortable for me than the Chris Reeve and Cosi. It has this nice curved back and then the downturn towards the butt that make it so that it fits really well even in my wide hand. You can see that I get enough grip space on this knife for all of my fingers to fit comfortably on it in this kind of hammer grip. So I really like the feel of the handle. It has some jimping. I don't know if you call this jimping, but whatever you call it, has it in a few different places to help to lock your hand in, and I appreciate that. It just really does feel comfortable. It feels like a good sized handle. One thing, getting this knife, I wanted to try an XM24, which is the larger version. They have a 3-inch XM18, then this, which is the 3.5-inch blade XM18, and then they have the XM24, which is a 4-inch blade, which is probably closer to this knife. But I actually ended up really liking the size of the handle on this knife. As for the blade, it does have a finger choil. They have both knives with and without finger choils. I'm not sure if they've made the Bowie blade without a finger choil, but I can use it. It is a little bit small probably for my finger. I mean, my finger's probably a little bit fatter than it needs to be, or than everybody's, but it might be a little small where, you know, I can kind of feel that heel of the edge on my finger, but it's something that I could use, especially in more of like a pistol type grip, holding on to that like that with the thumb on the kind of blade ramp, or even up here in this divot, which I do like that grip. I think it feels pretty good, putting my thumb up into this kind of curved area and holding on to the, almost really holding on to the flipper itself, like so. I really like the look of this blade shape. It's a very, very, I guess, emphasized clip point, which is, you know, why they call it a Bowie. Bowie knife is really historically probably not shaped like this, you know, the knife that he actually would have carried, but what has become known as the Bowie knife has this very, you know, extreme clip point to it. And I think it's a really good looking blade shape. I actually think that a lot of Hinderer's blade shapes are really well designed for both use and aesthetics. I think that their slicer grind is a really nice grind or blade shape. I like their spear point blade shape. I like their Sponto. Their Wharncliffe is a really good looking Wharncliffe blade, and this is a nice looking blade also. So I really do like the look of the knife. Now, I have to be honest, I haven't used this knife. We are in the midst of this, everything being shut down, and I plan to not hold on to this knife. So I haven't really used it, but it seems to be well ground. You can see it's not super thin on the grind, but you know, I think it would cut as well or probably better than, you know, some production knives, and it has, you know, a good usable tip, things like that. And it does seem to be really well made. So aside from the design, it seems to be really well made. You can see that it locks up maybe, what's that look like, about 30%. Sometimes people I have seen, and I haven't seen these complaints super recently, but I have seen people have some complaints that Hinderer knives have very early lockups. That's not the case with this one. I like where this locks up. You can see it's about, like I say, 30%. Again, comparing to Chris Reeve knives tend to be more at like 75%. So a little bit different philosophy on how to do the lockup, but this one locks up really well. No blade play forward to back at all. No side-to-side blade play locked, or even when unlocked. So the pivot is dialed in. Now, I believe just by how it feels that this is a ball bearing pivot. So it does flip well. The detent for me is, you know, fine, very snappy, definitely holds the knife closed, and, you know, is snappy enough to open it easily. And as you can see from me having done it a bunch, this knife is smooth enough that it drops closed every time, really. So nice and smooth. As I mentioned earlier, really, really well centered, pretty much perfect. Everything matches up nicely. Now, one thing about this specific knife is that, as you can see, it doesn't have the stock hardware. And what I mean by that is filler tab here, which fills the hole where the clip would go if you wanted it to be tipped down, or the screws, the standoffs here. So this knife did come with the normal ones, and as you can see, they're pretty much just plain, you know, silver colored steel. But these are titanium that the previous owner had, you know, purchased for this knife. So that is an option, and as I mentioned, Hinderer Knives says that won't void your warranty, putting these aftermarket hardware type things on. So that's an option if something you're interested in. It does give it a kind of interesting look. I was thinking with everything going on with the coronavirus pandemic, it almost would have been a little bit more fitting if instead of the nuclear symbol, it had been the bio symbol. I always think the bio symbol is a lot more like sinister looking. I don't know if that's, you know, because of some movie that had it in it or something like that, but it would have been a little bit more fitting if it had that rather than the nuclear, but still pretty cool. I do like how those look. I think that they're really well done. Not for everybody probably, but as I've mentioned in lots of other videos, I do like a little bit of flair on knives every now and then. So really well made, nice and solid lockup. Also has this lanyard hole, although I always don't really understand it when they put lanyard holes this far up on a knife handle. I mean, that's pretty much, yeah, that's going to be in your pocket. So, you know, I don't know. I wouldn't really use it anyway, but it does have it. But really well made, solid lockup, nice centering, really nice flipping. And to give you some comparisons of size, again, here is a Rat 1. So you can see they're pretty similar in size actually. The Rat 1 has, I think, a slightly longer blade and about the same size handle, or same length handle. So pretty similar in size on those two. If you are more of a traditional person, here is a grayish color number 15. I attempted to remove the dye from this, didn't go well, so I'm gonna have to re-dye it, but you can see the XM18 is a good bit bigger. Another really well-known traditional is the Case Trapper. So this is a Case full-size trapper. You can see a little shorter, but kind of getting towards the same general size. And then another modern knife, or two modern knives, I wanted to show are the Benchmade large Griptilian. So you can see relatively similar in size. The Griptilian maybe a little bit shorter handle and a little bit longer blade maybe. On the Endura, longer handle on the Endura a little bit, and also a slightly longer blade, but relatively similar in size. So that gives you a good idea. I would say that the size of this is big enough to be able to do pretty much everything you'd want to do with an EDC knife, but not too big to where it's, you know, cumbersome in your pocket, like, you know, maybe something like the Spyderco Police 4, although that one's not super cumbersome because it's pretty thin, or more so like something like the Cold Steel 4 Max, which you can see kind of dwarfs it. So good size knife for EDC and general tasks. I think it would work well for those more hard use things like being a first responder or in the military. I think it would be fine for that. That said, I don't always think that people in those situations are buying really high-end knives, because no matter how nice or solid a knife is, you don't want to, you know, snap the tip of a $500 knife or lose a $500 knife. These XM18s range from about $425 up to 550, things like that, in that general range, depending on which configuration, where you get it, what the materials are, stuff like that. Speaking of which, this is titanium, as I mentioned, this handle, and then it has S35VN blade, steel. So it's an expensive knife. It's in the pretty much same range, again, as a Chris Reeve knife. And as I mentioned in my Nkosi review, it's probably past where my value ratio dips. So I generally don't buy knives in this price range. And if I sound negative in the rest of this video, it's because I think that this is just past my personal price to value ratio, not necessarily past everybody's. But again, I didn't buy this knife, I traded into it, but at normal dealer prices, it's an expensive purchase for me. It would take some serious thought and planning to get something in that price range. And a kind of alternative is the zero tolerance. And Rick Hinderer has done several collaborations with zero tolerance and now Kershaw. So if you really like this design kind of flair that the Rick Hinderer XM18 has, you might want to look into a zero tolerance. Now, this is the ZT 0561. They also did the 0560, the couple other Rick Hinderer design knives, another one with a kind of similar design to the XM series, as well as some others also. And some of those being Kershaw collaborations. So there are designs by Rick Hinderer available at different price ranges. Now, this zero tolerance, the price is going to depend, and most of that is because it is discontinued at this point. Unfortunately, because I think this is zero tolerance's best knife ever, I would stand by that. It's a super good knife, and I think that they should continue making knives like this, but it is discontinued. You can find them on the secondary market for ranging prices, but originally these were somewhere around $250. So about half the price of this. And let's compare features, kind of direct feature to feature. So as you can see, they both have G10 handles, and they even both have the same design. Now, one thing I was noticing is that the ridges and the pattern of this, or the machining itself of the ZT, is less, I would say, crisp than on the Hinderer. Now, is that because I've had this knife for like 6 years or something like that? 8 years maybe? And it has just worn down? I don't know. I don't really think so. I think that this G10 is more cleanly, more crisply machined than on the ZT. Now, another thing you'll notice is that they both have titanium lock side scales. Unlike the Hinderer, the zero tolerance actually has CNC'd titanium lock side scale too. So I really like this. What it does is, unlike really most titanium frame locks, where one side is G10 or micarta, something like that, that is textured, usually the frame lock side is untextured. It's just plain or basically stonewashed like the Hinderer. But on this zero tolerance, they CNC'd it pretty much the same as the G10 side. And I think that that's a really, really nice touch. So that almost gives the upper hand on this specific point to the zero tolerance. You can see another difference here is that the lock bar has more of a cutout. It has this hole cutout for the zero tolerance, whereas the Hinderer doesn't. I think that that's probably a machining step that makes this easier to machine, whereas the Hinderer probably takes more time to machine. And that's just something where, part of the reason probably that it's $250 versus $500. continuing with the lock bar, this ZT0561 has a lock bar insert. Not all did, so there are some that don't have that, but this one is a later model that does have that, whereas the Hinderer does not. And I would definitely give that as an improvement or the upper hand to the ZT. So that's another thing where the ZT kind of comes out on top. One place that the ZT doesn't necessarily come out on top is the clip. Now, the clip on the Hinderer is not as deep carry a clip, but on a knife that's a bigger knife, it doesn't always matter to me if it's a deep carry clip or not. I do think that this the Hinderer clip is a little bit more ergonomic, whereas I actually have this tip down right now. I'm probably going to change it, but I've been carrying this tip down, whereas I prefer tip up carry pretty much all the time, only because this clip is just much more ergonomic in the tip down position. So the Hinderer does kind of win on that front. Moving on to the pivot, both knives have a male and female type pivot, and the Zero Tolerance has what they kind of stopped using for a while, but something that I really like on some of their knives is this, and what is that? Is that a hexagon? 1, 2, 3, no, sixagon. I can't believe I can't remember that, but it's a 6-sided pivot that makes it so that the pivot isn't going to rotate when you adjust it. So it works pretty similar to the pivot of the Hinderer, although you do have to have a Torx tool to adjust this pivot. So a little bit of a win for the Hinderer there. They both have ball bearing pivots, and both are really smooth. So as I was shown, this one is drop shut. This one is probably quite a bit more worn in because, as I've said, I've had it for a long time. But even being this smooth, it has no side-to-side play when unlocked and really solid when locked. So both really smooth pivots with that. One thing kind of at the pivot area, I do much prefer this design over this design. These are actually relatively pointy, so that, you can, I mean, it's not a big deal, but it kind of is something that I've noticed you can kind of catch on that, whereas these are a little bit less pointy. And what that is it is the stop pin, basically. So when you open the knife, the thumb stud, what looks like a thumb stud, is actually a stop pin. You can see that it's not actually touching that stop pin. That is the stop pin when it's closed. So that's what stops the knife from continuing when you close it. And same deal on this knife. That's kind of it's not something that was innovated by Rick Hinderer, but it's part of the design element. That's why they both have them. In general, I don't necessarily always love that design. I don't think that it's significantly worse or better than any other design. When I do like it, and which is actually the case on both of these, which is not on the case on all of the Zero Tolerance collaborations with Hinderer knives, is when it allows for 2 opening methods. So you can flip these open, and because of that thumb stud blade stop, you can also use it as a thumb stud. And that's the case also on, excuse the paint on my hands, I've been painting. That's also the case on the Hinderer, and it is designed for that to be used that way, and it is pretty easy to use as a thumb stud. So I do like that they have those, both have the 2 opening systems. Now another place where the Zero Tolerance wins out is on the flipper itself. And I'm sure some people watching this video, if you watch this far, will be like, oh, it's just because you have a wimpy finger, you toughen up, you shouldn't, it's not something to complain about. But this flipper, for me, is too sharp. You can see how it culminates into, because of this cutout, this jimping cutout, it culminates into a pretty thin ridge. And that ridge is part of this upturn, so that when you flip this knife, you are really kind of digging into that. And from, flipping this knife a lot, because I recently got it and was checking it out for the video and everything, my finger is a little bit sore. Now, one thing to be aware of is that, as I talked about earlier, the design influence of this knife is in large part for people in those first responder tactical type situations. And if you have a glove on, that's not going to be an issue. In fact, having that sharper point there when you have a glove on and don't have as much dexterity might be helpful. It might, help you to catch on the flipper and open it a little bit easier. But being that I think most people who are buying Hinderer knives are buying them because they enjoy knives less than they are because they need a knife that's going to work well in tactical situations, I do think that this is a little bit sharp, whereas the zero tolerance version, as you can see, has a good bit more rounding at the flipper where it comes to it. Now, it still has that upward turn to it, but the point itself is much more rounded, so that it does feel different. And although I do think that it could be a legitimate thing that this sharper point would give more purchase when you have gloves on, I don't think, and I have used this knife when I had gloves on, splitting wood or something like that, I don't think that it's going to be an issue to open this knife because it doesn't have as pointy of a flipper tab. So I do think that that's a win for the zero tolerance. Now, material-wise, they're pretty similar. As I mentioned, it's G10, it's titanium. One place where it's a little open for interpretation is the blade steel. I really like the LMAX on the zero tolerance, but there have been some reports of it not being heat treated well. I haven't had that issue at all with mine, but there have been reports of that, and different ZTs have different blade steels. They've had this model with different blade steels. The S35VN of the Hinderer is a really good blade steel. It is a very high-end blade steel, although it's not, necessarily an N390 or S110V, but it doesn't really need to be, and probably shouldn't be, with the design influence that I've talked about. S110V, other really high wear resistant steels, especially if heat treated to a high hardness like Spyderco or something like that does, would be more prone to chipping in those kind of harder use tactical or first responder scenarios. So I think S35VN is a good steel choice for a knife with that intended use profile. It also, again, comparing to Chris Reeve knives, is the same steel that Chris Reeve knives uses. And one last thing comparing those two brands, I find it somewhat interesting and almost kind of amusing that Chris Reeve knives has Idaho made on this same exact area of the titanium side handle scale, and Hinderer decided to put Hinderer there. So kind of funny to me, or interesting at least, how much these Hinderer knives seem to be aimed at being a direct competitor or a direct comparison or a kind of marketplace brother to the Chris Reeve knives. And as I was talking about, I think that for me, this knife is not as good a value as this knife. One last thing to compare between the two, Zero Tolerance and Kershaw have a really good warranty. I've had kind of disagreements with how they run their social media, but that's kind of neither here nor there. They have a good warranty and good service. I haven't used Hinderers, but it seems like they do probably too. But that's another point of comparison. I know that ZT has a good warranty. So between these two, I do think that the Zero Tolerance is a better value for me. For someone else, if that is, beyond your price to value ratio where it turns down, the Kershaw collaborations with Hinderer knives or with Rick Hinderer might be the better or more valuable option for you. And that's all kind of a personal thing, depending on, you know, how you use your knives, why you appreciate knives, all kinds of different things. For me, knives at this price range, like the Chris Reeve in Cosi and this Hinderer Knives XM18 Bowie blade, I appreciate the influence that they've had on the knife industry. I appreciate the innovation that they have put into the knife industry. I appreciate the high tolerances and the more custom feel that they have, or higher quality control. And I appreciate getting the chance to check them out and, at least for a short while, enjoy such, high-end knives. But they are something that I am not really willing to pay full dealer price for. So, really cool knife. I really, really like the design. I think that it's a really well-made knife, but I'd rather trade into it than pay full dealer price. So that's my thoughts on this knife. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I haven't upset too many people by, saying the same about this knife that I kind of did with the Chris Reeve, or by comparing it to the ZT. But it's just my opinion on it. Like I said, I have really enjoyed getting to check out this knife, and this is really the first time I've owned a Hinderer knife. So hopefully I'll own more in the future through, other similar deals. But it's been really cool to get to see this knife, and I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on it. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell for notifications so you know when I post other videos. Check out my website, knifethoughts.com, for articles on knives like this and knife-related topics. And check out on my social media. I'm on pretty much everything at Knife Thoughts. And as always, don't forget to go out and do good.